Greetings, everyone. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. Now, MFSA has been around for over 100 years. We're a faith-based policy and organizing network, and our mission is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a justice-seeking United Methodist movement, energizing people to be agents of God's justice, peace, and reconciliation. And we're so thankful to be co-hosting this series of webinars with our partners, United Methodist for Kairos Response. As in all of our webinars and gatherings, please join me as we acknowledge this land and the many lands that we are all joining this call from, its history and all of the being seen and unseen, known and unknown. As we step into this work on this land, most of us as uninvited guests, we offer this work in the spirit of reparation, devoting ourselves to justice as we strive to uplift the legacy of this place and all of these places. We invite you to acknowledge the indigenous land of where you are joining from and type that in the chat. A few announcements concerning our call today. By participating in our webinars, we all covenant together to co-create an equitable and brave space where we learn, engage, and grow in relationship together. We are recording this webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days. So be on the lookout for that. As you have questions, you can feel free to type them in the chat at any time. You don't have to wait for the Q&A to do that. That way you don't forget your question later. And closed captioning is available. It's automatically generated, so do expect that there'll probably be some spelling errors in the closed caption, but that's available. United Methodist for Kairos Response is an international justice movement of United Methodist laity and clergy, responding to the Kairos Palestine document and the ongoing work of Kairos Palestine and Global Kairos for Justice. They educate and mobilize advocacy for Palestinian rights within our denomination and beyond, striving for the goal of freedom, justice, and equity for all of the people of the Holy Land. Our moderator for today is the Reverend Dr. Susan Henry Crow. Susan is the recently retired General Secretary of the United Methodist General Board of Church and Society. Previously, she was the Dean of the Chapel and Religious Life at Emory University for 22 years. For more than 10 years, Henry Crow served as ecumenical collaborator with the World Council of Churches. She has also served for 16 years in the United Methodist Judicial Council, where she was the first woman to be elected president. She's an elder in the South Carolina Annual Conference. We welcome Susan as our moderator.
Thank you, Bridget. I'd like to welcome you all and say thank you to Kairos and also to MFSA for this extraordinary opportunity for us to come together to talk about Methodists in Palestine in a time of war. It's a very serious topic. I know that we all have deep commitments and concerns and differences of opinions. And this is a time both to listen and to share our questions. I'd like to begin, before I introduce our panelists, with a voice of a poet that you may know, Naomi Shihab Nye. We have read her for a long time, and she is a Palestinian American, and here is a poem entitled Blood. A true Arab knows how to catch a fly in his hands, my father would say, and he'd prove it, cupping the buzzer instantly while the host was the swatter stared. In the spring, our palms peeled like snakes. True Arabs believed a watermelon could heal 50 ways. I changed these to fit the occasion. Years before, a girl knocked, wanted to see an Arab. I said, we don't have one. After that, my father told me who he was. Shihab, shooting star, a good name borrowed from the sky. Once I said, when we die, we give it back. He said, that's what a true Arab would say. Today, the headlines clot in my blood. A little Palestinian dangles a truck on the front page. Homeless fig, this tragedy with a terrible root is too big for us. What flag can we wave? I wave the flag of stone and seed, table mat stitched in blue. I call my father and we talk around the news. Is it too much for him? Neither of his two languages can reach it. I drive into the country to find sheep and cows to plead in the air. Who calls anyone civilized? Where can the crying heart graze? What does a true Arab do now? It's my great pleasure to introduce our fellow panelists. Bishop Ivan Abrams is the fourth General Secretary of the World Methodist Council and the first South African in that position. He began his tenure in 2012. From 2003 to 2012, Bishop Abrahams served as the presiding bishop of the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, one of the largest Christian denominations in Southern Africa. During that time, he provided prophetic leadership and direction, which we all remember and know, including the successful completion of the Seth Mokitmi Methodist Seminary. Bishop Abrahams is well versed in casting vision, providing spiritual and strategic leadership, developing policies and procedures in line with values, goals, and the mission of the church to achieve its vision. A renowned ecumenist and advocate for social justice, Bishop Abrahams is active in various fora, including the All African Conference of Churches and the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches. He is married to Esme Abrahams, who's the General Hospital Manager and CEO of Netcare Garden City Hospital in Johannesburg. Together, they have 3 children and 4 grandchildren. Following the remarks of Bishop Abrahams will be Mr. David Wildman, who is the Executive Secretary for Human Rights and Racial Justice with the United Methodist Church and the General Board of Global Ministries, as he serves as the GBGM liaison and steering committee to UMKR. He works on behalf of GBGM with grassroots partners in the Middle East and Afghanistan, and visits Palestine, Israel, and other parts of the Middle East regularly. David was the co-founder of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, which is now the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, in 2001, and has served on its steering committee. He also helped found United for Peace and Justice in October of 2002. He serves on the World Council of Churches Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Forum core group. From 1989 to 2001, he facilitated justice and peace seminars in the Church Center for the United Nations. He's a board member of the National Farm Worker Ministry and is active in corporate accountability work with the Interfaith Center on corporate responsibility. David holds both an MDiv and a Master of Philosophy toward doctoral work in social ethics from Union Theological Seminary in New York. We are very appreciative to both of you for your insights and the things that you learned on your recent trip and the way that you give witness to this very critical work on behalf of Methodists around the world. We'll now turn to Bishop Abrahams and welcome you and appreciate what you have to share with us.
Thank you very much, moderator, for this opportunity to reflect on our recent visit to Palestine. My life has been shaped on the anvil of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And during my recent visit to Palestine, one of the things that flashed on my memory again and again was Thomas Hardy's remark when he says, "Peace on earth, we sing it, and pay 1,000,000 priests to bring it. But after 2,000 years of mass, we've got as far as poison gas." Thomas Hardy is cynical and very critical of the church. In his Christmas message preached at the Lutheran Church in Bethlehem, Reverend Munter Isaac challenged us to look into the mirror and to ask, where was I when Gaza was going through genocide? Last year, in December, a group of Christian leaders in South Africa heard the call from our sisters and brothers in Palestine when they said, and I quote from the text that was sent to us, where they said, "Please don't write any more statements and prayers. Come and stand by us this Christmas." We decided that Christmas can only have any meaning for us if we heed the call from our sisters and brothers in Palestine, and if we go and stand in solidarity with them. We also felt very strongly that we needed to break the silence, that we could not be complicit, that it was our moral obligation and a biblical imperative to go and to stand by those who were victims and injustice. It also seemed to us that the international community had failed the Palestinians and that we needed to stand on the right side of history when it comes to the Palestinian issue or crisis. My colleague David, who was with us, will share more or in detail, but we met with the religious leaders, both Christian and Muslim, and we heard their stories. We met with civil society members, with Israeli ambassador to South Africa. We also met with the family of persons who were taken hostage by Hamas. We met with the mayor of Bethlehem and also with children who were taken to Amman by special dispensation. These were children who needed oncology facilities, and that was facilitated by the King of Jordan. We were warmly received by everyone who again and again thanked us for coming. They said that the Magi brought frankincense, gold, and myrrh, but that we brought the most valuable gift, and that is of ourselves. If one looks at the pictures and photographs that were taken during our visit, there are many signs and slogans written everywhere, but one that really caught my attention was a slogan above the mayor's office in Bethlehem that said, "Palestine gave the world Christ, the Prince of Peace. Give Palestine peace and justice." Again, I will not go into the stories that we heard. We heard stories of hunger, of frustration, of humiliation. The word genocide was freely used. The word ethnic cleansing was used by many. Others spoke about how scripture is weaponized. And there was a call from everybody for a ceasefire. And when the group from South Africa got back, we briefed the Minister of International Relations and her team about our visit. We committed to amplify the voices of Palestinians. We committed ourselves to intensify the call for a ceasefire, and we also committed to host a major conference in South Africa in May of this year that will focus on apartheid and Israel and the way ahead. We also heard folks very often speaking about terror groups and terrorism. And I just want to conclude by saying that someone who has become a global icon, Nelson Mandela, was once labeled a terrorist by most of the Western media. And today he is a global icon, and as a person who used soft power to bring about peace and reconciliation in South Africa. And again, to say that there's a big difference between a terrorist and a people who are fighting for freedom, for justice, and for human dignity. And we were reminded again and again that we must relook at our language. Who are the real hostages? Palestinians tell us that they've been held hostage for 75 years. Let me stop there, and I will gladly field any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bishop. Your witness and your presence, not only on behalf of yourself, but on behalf of all of us, is very important, and we thank you so very much. Let's turn now to David, who is, I believe, your companion on that trip.
Yeah, thanks, Susan, and thanks, Bishop Ivan, and thanks all for the chance to share a little bit about our delegation. I'll try and add to what Ivan has shared already. And I've had the blessing of traveling with Bishop Ivan several times to Gaza as well. So my office is right, as many of you know, right across the street from the United Nations. And I've been closely engaged, along with a number of other religious leaders and NGOs here, to try and do whatever we could here in New York to push the Security Council and the UN to do more and support UNRWA and the other agencies. So when I got a word from South Africa about this delegation, and from our Palestinian colleagues, the invitation to say, please come and see at this critical time of Christmas, Advent and Christmas, I knew I had to go and figure out how to make that happen. And so there was a lot of support of folks who couldn't make the trip, but were very supportive. And so it's always a collective effort. But it was a humbling experience to go with South African colleagues there. I'll try and just touch on a few things. I think we all had this moment of hope in the end of November, when for a week there was a pause in the fighting, and there were some hostages that were released. There were Palestinian prisoners that were released. And yet when the fighting resumed, the intensification of Israeli bombardment was worse than ever. And so many people have died needlessly since then in Gaza and across the West Bank. And I hope we can kind of talk a little bit also about the West Bank in our time, because it's more violent than ever there, but the crisis of genocide is most apparent in Gaza. For me, the trip was really a chance to embody the call of Advent of Emmanuel, of God with us. And it's like to answer to that Reverend Munter Isaac's sermon on Christmas Eve, of like Christ being born today would be born under the rubble. How can we be with Emmanuel? How can God be with us if God is under the rubble? Well, I think this year we need to stop the rubble. We need to stop the genocide. Emmanuel means removing the rubble and showing up for our sisters and brothers when they're most in need in Palestine. And so that's, for me, a part of this trip, was embodying that sentiment of Emmanuel, of God with us, even in the hardest of times facing genocide. And you know, in the Advent story, there's angels, and they keep telling you, fear not, but they don't tell you that there's nothing to fear. And I think that was an important aspect of how we approached this solidarity mission to connect with our Palestinian sisters and brothers, and with the Israeli human rights groups, and visit with the hostage families in Tel Aviv, was to take heed to the angels of fearing not at this time when people are threatened, when Palestinian citizens of Israel are being arrested for posting on social media that they're concerned about people in Gaza, where students on campuses across the United States and in other countries are being vilified and demonized because they're lifting up signs for a free Palestine and release of the hostages. And so I think in that context, we need to listen again to the angels to say, fear not. And the response of the shepherds, of the wise ones, was, let's go and see. So this trip was very much about that. And I know many on the call have gone and seen before. 5 years ago, in December of 2018, I was in Gaza visiting partners and projects. And one of the places I visited that we've supported for many years is a mother-child health clinic in the Shujaya refugee camp area in the north. And it's an amazing clinic that does amazing work with lots and lots of kids under 5. And the doctors there reported that some 30% of the children suffered from anemia in 2018. I've had the occasion to suffer repeatedly from anemia myself. So I know the lack of energy, the struggle just to get up and get through the day. That was when things were supposedly normal in Gaza. Now, it's only worse. When there's not food, there's not medicines, there's no access to hospitals. Many of the hospitals, most of them, are closed. And the ones open are only partially functioning. And so I lift that up to say that the Palestinians in Gaza have been suffering for a long, long time, and over half of the population are children. And the world has really abandoned them. So that's why we went, was to sort of express our needs. 1 year ago, we were in Gaza in October of 2022. We visited vocational training centers. We visited a trauma healing center for young girls and teenage girls that had been through trauma of bombardment and the multiple wars that Gaza has faced. We visited the Greek Orthodox Church and also the Catholic Church there. We visited El Ali Hospital, and every single one of those places has been bombed and either badly damaged or completely destroyed. I think 100% of the people that we met a year ago are homeless now. Their homes having been damaged or completely destroyed. Some of them are dead. My friends that are Palestinians that we met in Bethlehem talked about loved ones and relatives in Gaza that they could not visit and hear only of their death or their injury or not being able to get cancer treatments. And there was nothing that they could do in Bethlehem except maybe be in touch briefly by text or phone when the phones had a little bit of electricity in Gaza. I don't think we can imagine the horror that people are living through now. And yet there's this Arabic word, samud, steadfastness, that really is exhibited more than ever by Palestinians today, especially in Gaza, but in the West Bank too. And so we met with former prisoners who had been released. A young man who was 17 had been sentenced to 8 years in prison for throwing a stone, even though he was under house arrest at the time that he was alleged to have thrown the stone several blocks from his house. He served 8 years, but then had 2 more years added on because his family couldn't pay for the cost of his incarceration. Many of the Palestinian prisoners' families are forced to pay for their being incarcerated, often without charge or with charges where there's a 99.5% conviction rate. Now, during that pause that I said was that moment of hope where there was over 100 Israeli and international hostages that had been released, there were 240 Palestinian prisoners released. Most of them had never been charged. And I think we need to examine our language and the labels, as Ivan suggested, of why are some called hostages and others are called prisoners. But since October 7th, over 6,300 Palestinians have been detained and arrested, most of them without charge by the Israeli military. So more and more people are facing harassment and imprisonment. It's estimated that over 1 million Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem have at some point been imprisoned. And so in the same way that those of us in the United States talk about Black Lives Matter to address police brutality and the rounding up of people in Black and brown communities, we need to say today, Palestinian lives matter. And the call from Palestine was, in the face of genocide, we're hearing only silence from the global church, from the global international community. And so our being there was to be a part of a manual of showing up for our sisters and brothers, to say, we're here with you in a small, humble way for the 20 of us that were able to make it. But also, we're breaking that silence. We're going back with a message like today to all our sisters and brothers in our churches and in our governments to say, stop the genocide. And, there's been some debate about should we use the word genocide. And frankly, there's some folks that are more disappointed and more disturbed and upset by a word than they are by the massive killing. Advent is a time where we celebrate and anticipate pregnancy and birth of Mary giving birth to a Savior, to Emmanuel, God with us. Each and every day in Gaza, 180 Palestinian women give birth. most of them can't make it to a hospital. If they make it to the hospital, it may not be functioning. And if they need a C-section, if there's any complications, there may be no meds and there's certainly no anesthesia. The lucky ones can stay for maybe 3 hours before they're put in a chair and somehow being told to leave, to go somewhere. But where do they go? There's no home. They have no clothes for the baby, no diapers. How do you provide milk as a mother that's nursing when you yourself have no clean water to drink and you're not sure where the next meal is coming from? Last week, I heard an update. Catholic Relief Services, American Friends Service Committee, other groups have been joining with UNRWA to deliver food. And one organization was able to deliver 20,000 meals. And I thought about it, and 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, if they are able to get 3 meals a day, which should be their right, which should be what's considered normal, that's 6.9 million meals a day. And humanitarian organizations are able to deliver 20,000 meals or 50,000 meals. That's not even a drop in a bucket for the needs of an entire community where half of the people there are children. Now, we met with the Palestinian prisoners. We also met with Israeli families of hostages. The Rabbis for Human Rights and Sabil, the Palestine Liberation Center, worked together to enable us to be able to visit briefly in Tel Aviv. And there was a saying among all of the hostage families that we heard over and over again, which was all for all. Release all the hostages, but also Israel needs to release all the Palestinian prisoners. And so I suddenly heard the biblical mandate, the call over and over in scripture saying, release all the captives, was a message that speaks to us today and that we need to embody in our demands, that all the hostages be released and that all the Palestinians held without charge, with charge, be released as well. To be able to meet with folks, with South Africans who themselves had been tortured and detained and imprisoned, was a very powerful moment to realize that the suffering in the work for justice is often hidden. We don't see it when we meet with somebody. And so it was a very moving moment to see how important it was to connect with folks that had come out and said, you know, we can't let our sisters and brothers remain isolated and silenced in prison. So we need to work more than ever. And the ones that were able to be released was when there was a ceasefire, which is why a ceasefire is so urgent right now. Now, when we were in Bethlehem during Christmas, the streets were empty. The Church of the Nativity was empty. In Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was empty. So empty, in fact, that they were doing renovations in there because they had little equipment and stuff that they could do some renovations because there were no people there. It's estimated something like 60% unemployment today in Bethlehem because how heavily it depends on tourism. In Bethlehem and Jerusalem, we walked past hotels that were completely closed. There was no business. So there'd be plenty of room this year if Jesus were to come to Jerusalem or Bethlehem in the inn. But sadly, that's being denied by all the checkpoints. Palestinians can't get safely from Bethlehem to Ramallah, which are both on the West Bank, let alone go to Jerusalem. And so the checkpoints, the closures, the settlers that are shooting. I have a friend who shared that his grandson, who's 7, announced that he's not going to school. And his parents said, well, you know, you should, no, you need to go to school. And then he went to his grandparents and said, my parents don't like me. They don't love me anymore. And so he talked a little further. And the reason why was because the road that he had to go on to get to his school was where there were settlers that regularly shot at Palestinian cars. And so he was afraid that going to school meant going to a place where you could get shot. That's a small story of what's happening to children across the West Bank, let alone the children in Gaza, of the suffering and loss that they face. Now, when this trip happened, and I knew there was quite a few folks from South Africa, I was like, I'm a Christian living in the heart of the empire. We have to have someone from the US go. And I and my family, Karen and our children, were able to negotiate. So this was a team and a family effort for me to change my schedule as for everyone on the delegation. And so I want to share a little bit about like, what's the message from the wise ones? I don't know if I'm wise, but like we're returning another way to talk to our governments. What is the message? And I'd like to lift up Martin Luther King. It's still the month of his birthday, when we recognize him and at least listen to his words again. A year before he was assassinated, King made a speech at Riverside Church here in New York City on Beyond Vietnam, and came out publicly against the Vietnam War. It was a powerful, powerful speech, and I'd urge folks to read that if you can. He said something in there, though, that I want to challenge us with today, and hopefully we can get into this in the questions. And he said that the Vietnam War is but a symptom of a larger malady in the US spirit, and I would say today in the global spirit, of militarism, of racism, and of materialism, of corporate greed, of all the many war companies that are profiting from this ongoing genocide. And so today, I want to say what I took away from this delegation, that Hamas is but a symptom of the larger structure of oppression and dispossession that's going on. Netanyahu is but a symptom. The current government in Israel is but a symptom. The administration in the United States is but a symptom of a deeper problem in the world that bends its knee to the might of military force instead of following the one who was born as a baby, that needs us to show up for Emmanuel to become real, God with us today in justice. I'll leave you with my favorite text, which is the from Luke 18 of the widow and the unjust judge, where Jesus talks about, let me tell you a story about the need to pray always and not lose heart. There are way too many widows today in Palestine, and there are some widows in Israel. And Jesus lifts up the widow as the model of leadership, not only of needing charity, but as a model of leadership of how we pave a path to justice. She must have heard those angels to say, fear not, to go to an unjust judge and demand justice. That's what Palestinians are doing. That's what South Africa did at the International Court of Justice. That's what we must do today. And there's a growing global movement to call for ceasefire, to call for a global arms embargo on Israel until these atrocities end. We need to hear the angels as well, to fear not. But the widow did not do it alone, and we're not sure if she ever changed the unjust judge's mind, but she certainly changed his behavior. I think that if folks who visited Jerusalem and know about Damascus Gate, the different gates to Jerusalem, the judges would sit in judgment at the gate. That's where Amos says, establish justice at the gate. So it was a public place. I think as each time that widow came demanding justice, there were more people in the crowd who heard an angel saying, fear not, join us, and joined her demand for justice. It didn't work at first. It didn't work the second or the third or the fifth or 10th time, but it will work. And so today, I think the challenge from our delegation was not just our delegation, the 20 of us that were there. not just the people that we met with, but we're part of a global crowd that are listening to the angels saying, "Fear not, and let us join the Palestinian widows demanding justice now in Palestine." Thank you.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you turning to preaching. As we have a lot of questions, and I will offer those. I want to lead with a question, sort of picking up on what you said, David, about pave a path to justice. And I'd like to ask Bishop Ivan if he would say just a little bit more about the International Court ruling and what that means.
Well, I think that the International Court ruling is important in terms of the morality and in terms of justice. And we thank the South African government who had the courage to bring this case of plausible genocide to the International Court of Justice. I'm personally a bit disappointed that the court did not call for a ceasefire. And it is also very, very interesting how some of the media says that this is a victory for Israel, that the court did not call for a ceasefire. And for me personally, this is about international justice and morality.
Thank you.
Oh,
Sorry.
Susan, can I just add 2 cents on the
Sure.
on the IC? Because I was just at a committee meeting over at the UN this morning, and the ambassador from South Africa spoke there, and she also mentioned the disappointment around the ceasefire, but also that all the provisions that the court did mandate on Israel as a party to the convention on the prevention and as well as punishment of the crime of genocide could not happen without a ceasefire. So it was like just the terminology. But she also said that urged other states to join in appeals to supporting the court for further actions. And that includes turning to the Security Council, that there's a report back in a month. But I also want to say that, like, in some ways, I think it's a call for a unilateral ceasefire, that Israel as a party to the convention needs to act now, no matter what, not with negotiations, but act now on the orders from the court that South Africa called for to stop all military action, to enable complete humanitarian access across Gaza. And they're certainly not doing that yet. So I think that there's some very strong things, but it's only as strong as member states and civil society, the rest of us, are willing to make it real.
Thank you. A question that's been asked several times is a little bit more explanation about UNRWA and the meaning of that. We know that it was a small number of people that were accused, but maybe if both of you would comment on that, it would be helpful. Starting with you, David.
Sure. It is beyond ironic that within 24 hours of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, it is issuing a ruling that is a mandatory one to be enforced by all member states that have signed the convention. It's 153 members. That there are allegations that surface that lead to collective punishment, that so far 13 governments have imposed collective punishment on an entire organization of over 30,000 staff and on several million recipients of school children, of folks that go to UNRWA health care facilities, without any due process yet. Now, the allegations are quite serious, but they're not new in terms of Israel's government vilifying UNRWA. And I think we need to understand that this is part of a larger strategy of undercutting the UN as a whole and questioning it. And so I think we need to stand. I give a shout out to Norway, the government of Norway, as well as the Norwegian Refugee Council and others that have stood up and say, Indonesia just this morning said they are paying their entire yearly contribution to UNRWA in the month of February. Now, the US didn't have to do this. Their next payment is scheduled for UNRWA in June. They didn't have to, they could have quietly said, look, what's with these allegations? Let's support an investigation. But instead, they publicly vilify an entire, and this is why I say we have to call it collective punishment, and we have to challenge the US government, because Congress, for those of us in the US, the US Congress often has hearings and efforts to cut all funding to UNRWA, and it happened in the previous administration, and to vilify and demonize people who are working 24/7 under bombardment. So it's an outrage.
Thank you. Bishop Ivan, can you make any comments?
And, I just want to emphasize again that what we're talking about here and why South Africa went to the International Court of Justice is all about the rule of law. And that, again, re-emphasize with my brother that it is interesting that these allegations only followed after the ruling. And what about due process? I mean, the International Court of Justice, South Africa and Israel had an opportunity to state their case, and there was due process, and we all need to follow international justice and the rule of law. But there's no due process as far as the allegations are concerned.
I'm going to get to the question of what Methodists can do in a minute, but before we go there, both of you have alluded to this a little bit, but the expansion of the war into the West Bank, can you comment on that?
Well, something that David and I did not mention is the on Christmas Day, there was bombing in certain parts of Bethlehem. We had just left before the bombing, and there's still continuous detentions and brutality in other parts of the West Bank, Ramallah, Jenin, and so we can mention all the places where Palestinians are not safe.
And David, the number that you mentioned of arrests is huge. It's huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's arrests happening. I mean, just yesterday in Jenin, people may have seen that this is a grave violation, one of many grave, but the latest example of an undercover Israeli operatives went into a hospital disguised as Muslim women and doctors and assassinated 3 patients that were in the hospital in the middle of the night. They could have arrested them if they had reason to think that there was charges and had them be subjected to a trial, although getting due process in military courts is pretty limited. But they didn't. They assassinated them in the hospital. There are nightly raids in Jenin, Tulkarem, Nablus, Ramallah. So the war is more violent. The military occupation, the dispossession is ongoing. The settlers feel they've been given free rein. About the only thing the US government has done that shows some measure of acknowledgement of caution in their behavior, as opposed to sort of rhetoric where they claim to care about civilians, is to refuse to allow a shipment of small arms, of rifles and machine guns to that would go to the settlers, because the Israeli government wants to further arm settlers to act with impunity across the West Bank. There are already Bedouin villages and small villages in the Area C area, in the rural areas of the West Bank, that have been ethnically cleansed, 100%, 50 people, 100 people, all the families have just up and moved because there's so much harassment and violence that they've been facing already. They were like, we can't live here. So the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank is continuing and expanding because it's been going on for years, over 50 years. So I think it's just, we need to always put this in a historical context, that the settlers have been, even on the whole time of Oslo, the settlers were growing and taking more land in Hebron, in East Jerusalem, and across the West Bank.
There are a number of questions.
And I'll just say one last thing is that every Palestinian we met with in Bethlehem and Jerusalem has said, we're next. We're watching what's happening in Gaza, but we're next. And that's a troubling, troubling message.
It is. You've both spoken about ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. If you were to give us guidance about what Methodists and people of faith need to unite around, and pastors need to talk about, and congregations need to gather around, what would you say, beginning with Bishop Ivan?
I think the first thing that we need to be very sensitive to is the weaponizing of Scripture. We saw that very clearly in South Africa, where Scripture is used to legitimate certain causes. And in this case, there is a growing Christian Zionism, where the Bible is used to legitimate and to condone what is happening at the moment, that Israel is the chosen people, and this form of Zionism need to be rejected. Also, I think we need to return to the Kairos document that speaks about state and church theology and prophetic theology, and that we need to stand on the side of those who bring a prophetic voice to the situation in Palestine, Israel. And very often that is not an easy and comfortable task. I believe that peace building can be messy at times. And if we really say that we stand on the side of peace and on justice, we need to roll up our sleeves and sometimes get our hands dirty.
David, do you want to add anything?
Sure, a couple of things. Yeah, thank you, Bishop Ivan. On the Kairos Palestine is just, yeah, this is a document to the world. I mean, it is really a gift Palestinian Christians have given to the world. And I think we can still go to it and learn from it and take it to heart. I would add a couple of things. One is a ceasefire now. And I think that basically we should shift. There's a propaganda war going on. All wars, but this war in particular, always happen on at least two levels. There's the war on the ground. And I think we've tried to share a little of the suffering of what's happening in Gaza, the fears and suffering in the West Bank. There's also a propaganda war about what's the spin that's put on what's happening. And we need to challenge and fight that propaganda war in the mainstream media, in our respective context, national contexts, and reject some of the language that's just atrocious. This is not a war of Israel versus Hamas. It's not even a war of Israel and Gaza. This is a war of Israel against Palestine. It's a genocide. And if we don't get caught up, I mean, I think, I don't know if it's been dropped in the chat yet, but there's a powerful quote from the United Methodist Church Social Principles that we've had for a number of years, since I think at least 2012 or 2008, I think maybe. Anyways, but the church regards the practice and the commission of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression as infamous and atrocious evils. Notice it doesn't say, well, do we need to sort if it's war crimes one thing, if it's crimes against humanity another thing, if it's genocide. No, these are all egregious and must stop. And they must be unconditionally prohibited by all governments and shall never be tolerated by the church. We have our marching orders that this has to stop. So what can we do? I think there's a growing call that was launched by 16 humanitarian and human rights organizations last week. It now has over 70 that have signed on for an end to arms transfers globally to Israel and the Palestinian militants. But it's an end to all arms transfers in both directions, because sadly, there's a number of countries in the global south who express solidarity with the Palestinian people, but are happy to buy arms and surveillance technology from the state of Israel and from Israeli companies. That needs to be challenged. And the US especially, but also the United Kingdom, Sweden, Germany, others that sell to Israel have to stop. It's their legal obligation under the International Court of Justice to use an arms embargo like this to stop. We need to support the International Criminal Court, the Court of Justice, in its ruling and its proceedings, and lend weight to that to enforce it. Then I'd say we can also look at diplomatic sanctions, and something that many on the call I know and many in the churches have been doing for a long time is boycott, divestment, and sanctions as non-violent acts of love to stop the harm that's being done, of the genocide, of the dispossession and displacement of the Nakba, the catastrophe that Palestinians are facing yet again. And I think if we join with our Palestinian sisters and brothers, if we join with rabbis for ceasefire now, there are many, many groups around the world. All of the actions of civil disobedience, of statements, of letters, of calls to governments have not ended the genocide yet, but they've made a powerful mobile movement. The power makers are listening, but they've not yet heeded and changed their behavior. And that's what we need to do, like the widow long ago.
Our time has come to a close, and I want to thank you both and to say that I think you're right, that we are standing together as people of faith. There's so much more to do, but we're very grateful to the Church of Southern Africa for taking it forward to the International Court of Justice, because it does give us a way to continue to support that. There are ways to give in the United Methodist Church, which I will not go into all of that right now, but there are ways that you can, we can stand together with people of faith around the world and continue to raise our voices and make our commitments, and to teach and to not weaponize Scripture. So there is much that we can do. And I think your witness from all of you who came together on this call today is a very strong statement about the commitments that we have. So thank you all for being here. I'll turn it back over to Bridget now for closing remarks.
Hey everyone, thank you again for joining us today. Thank you for this very important conversation. I have had a lot of folks ask about the recording. We did record the webinar today. It will be shared out. They'll be both on MFSA's and UMKR's websites, on our YouTube channels. It'll also be emailed out in our next newsletters. So please take a look at that and also share it. Share it with your churches, share it with your friends, share it with your Sunday school classes. Very important to continue to get more information out. We will be gathering again next month. February 21st is our next webinar. So please mark your calendars. It will be at 2 p.m. Eastern, and there'll be more information in terms of how to sign up, but we'll be focusing on legislative priorities for General Conference on Palestine and Israel. So it'll be a very important conversation. So I hope you will join us next time. Thank you everyone for being with us today.